Today we're going to talk about particles, and I'll try to come up with an example that will be a very simple thing and probably something that you wouldn't associate particles with, but it's going to be simple, although thorough enough for you to recap on certain concepts that probably you either don't know at all, like channels, or you don't know that much or so well how to manipulate them. So the goal here is to come up with a particle system that will give us droplets on, let's assume, the lens of our camera, but could have been like a piece of glass in front of our camera, say for example a window or something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a particle emitter. First of all, let's make sure that whatever geometry, in this case whatever card we put in our 3D system, will give us exactly this aspect. And now we already covered this in other sessions, but we're gonna do the same here today. So you open a random card, generic card, and then a generic camera as well. Okay, and now the thing is, you're gonna link the focal length from the camera, whatever that might be, to the lens in focal of our card, and the same goes for the horizontal apertures. With this, you're making sure that the card is always in the frustum of our camera. I'm just gonna reduce the resolution because this is a 5K. It's just gonna reduce the resolution of my card to become one row and one column. Cool. So now that we have this, I'm just gonna move this aside, and this will be actually my emitter, and this will be emitting particles as a default setting from the points. I don't want this from the points, I want this from the faces, so I'll have a random distribution of our particles, and of course the particles will be shooting from that emitter, and that's not what I want. I want them to born and die within the actual emitters. So I'm just going to reduce the velocity to 0, and now I have that. So let's see how this looks like on my scanline render. So this looks like this, a bit too flickery, so we need to reduce emission rate because there's too many at the moment. Okay, we need just a few like this, and they are born and dying very fast, so I need to extend the lifetime to at least something that will have the same number of frames of my frame range. Let's put this to 80. So now they start existing from the first frame, and they live for the entire frame range. Let's put this a little bit before, so you start your simulation a little bit before your first frame. I still think that there's too many particles, so I'm just going to reduce this to say 0.2. Let's say that I'm happy with this, and this will be my starting point for my droplets. So now the droplets, what happens is there's always some gravity involved, and some of them will actually slide through that piece of glass or the lens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gravity node right next to the emitter. The default settings are too strong, so I need to just add a few zeros in here, and we're going to adjust this later on, okay? But this is what's happening. And now I don't want to apply this uniformly across all particles, so I'm going to go into the conditions tab, and I'm going to put this probability slider a little bit lower, so we just affect some of them. I'm happy with this, and now we can start messing with these particles. So the first thing to do, of course, this is too even and we don't have an actual particle. So let's create a particle, and normally for this type of situations I like to use a radial. So in this one I'm gonna just put a constant that will always be attached to my project settings, and now I'm gonna open a radial like this, and I'm just gonna change the values of the radial so they will take the input width and height, so they will be automatically adjusted to any situation. So this will be the width and this will be the height. Okay, so now I have this on my RGBA channels. I'm going to use this as my particle, but there's an actually very important thing to do, which is always to use a blend matte. Why is that? Because the blend matte, if it's not here, some of the properties of my simulation, like for example color, will be overwritten by whatever is in here, and I don't want that, necessarily speaking. Plus, if you want to use external nodes to change some of these settings as well, if you don't have a blend material node in here, this will not work. So I would say 99% of the times in my particle input, I always have a blend material node set to modulate. Plus, this will keep your transparency from the actual radial intact. So in this radial, I don't want any fall off at the moment, so I'm just going to delete this to something like this, and I'm going to make sure that this is a circle, so I'm just going to put this to a square format like this, and this will be my particle. So now I have my particles round as my actually particle input. So now what we have to do is to add some breakup to the shape of my particles, because they are too perfect and that's not very realistic to what we're trying to achieve here. So I'm just going to drop a normal noise, and I want this noise to follow whatever format comes out of the scanline render. So I'm going to use a remove node, so I remove all the channels just to seal the format, and I'm going to use this to just create some vectors, and now I can start messing with the shape of my particle. See that this is already changing. Maybe this is not enough, so I need to reduce this so they will be even more weird shape as normal droplets. One thing that I also want to do is to vary the size of my particles. So I'm going to go to the particle emitter. I'm going to use the size slider so they will be a bit bigger. I'm going to use the size range to give it some variation. And now I want to add those particles into here. So first of all, the particle will always introduce some blurriness. So I'm just going to drop a blur in here, and I'm just going to use that as my mask to blur my image here. Okay, so we can see some of that there. But this is not enough. So what we have to do is to create some sort of distortion. So we will distort things a bit more realistically. I have my distortion nodes that I believe we already covered here to achieve different things, but at the moment let's try to create something that's not going to be exactly the same, but it's going to be something alternative for you to use if you want. So the first thing you want to do is to, from these particles, you want to create also some vectors to distort your image. You want to copy the alpha channel into here. I'm going to use the same forward V, and now you're going to start using that to distort your image. And let's try to introduce that thing. You see that is definitely distorting the image behind, but this is not giving us the result that we want, because in order for you to have some sort of more realistic distortion, you have to actually blur the channels that you are distorting. That's when you start achieving a good distortion, because the edges of your channels, in this case the channels to distort, will be closer to the limits in which they live, and because of that you're going to create a more realistic distortion, similar to what you would do on an SD map. So let's use this, just blurring those channels. So let's see what this gives us. Let's maybe increase the size overall of my particles. Maybe we're going to go overboard to start with, and then we're going to start reducing. So let's say this one is okay. So this is starting to look a little bit better, and then you could also introduce some of this blurriness only on the edges of your matte, and you can use an edge selection. I have mine called edge matte, and I use this node all the time. So this will select the edge of my input, and now I can start blurring outside or inside. So let's see what this gives us. I'm going to use this directly from my alpha channel. Okay, so this will actually give me something interesting as well. Let's see what happens if I start blurring this outside. This will give me sort of an edge, which I like. And this is basically what the tool I'm about to show you does. Let's just plug this alpha and this on my image, and let's see what this does. So you can increase the distortion, and you can blur it more or less to achieve different looks. You can also invert the direction in which this is actually happening. Let's stick with this one for now, and this will be your droplets as well. So I think that this blur is a little bit too strong, so I'm just gonna put it down a bit, and now we have our particles appearing in our image automatically, and some of them will go down, and the speed will vary depending on the particle. We can readjust this, of course, and we should, but what's inside in here, instead of using a selection like this, I'm using a selection based on a matrix. These are my inputs, my particles, and then this matrix will actually select specific directions of my input, and this will be, for example, the bottom part, and this will be one of the sides. This is the similar way you can create fake normals, for example. I'm not going to get into what this matrix does, which is a convolution matrix. I'm just showing you at the moment what it does for the purpose. And then basically you're going to combine the two, and we're going to use them as vectors. So that's exactly what we are doing here. I'm just going to use this because I'm more comfortable with this, and I prefer this look, to be honest. I don't like this, so I'm just going to delete it. And instead I'm going to create a new one based on my particles, but I'm just going to put this on top. If I want to blur that, I will have some blurriness on top of that distortion, but you'll see that this is actually taking the transparencies as they are. So I need to grow this a bit, otherwise I'm not going to reach the limit of my distortion. So I'm just going to use an erode, just a touch, and maybe use this as a Gaussian filter. Another one before, just to grow a bit, as a normal box filter. So I'll go until the very edge, and then the other one will give me a nice fall off. Let's just take this down a bit. You can blur them more or less depending on what you're going for. Of course, if this would be on the lens of our camera, this would have to be very out of focus, almost imperceptible. And you can also go for that look if that's what you want. You can either decrease the distortion or increase the blurriness in here, so you'll have just that effect there. You don't see really the droplet, but you see what the droplet is doing to our scene. And you can have the mix of both of them. Then you're gonna max these two results. You can affect more or less that look with that droplet. Okay, maybe this will help you a bit. You can adjust this to taste, and this is basically how you do it. So of course now what we're missing is the actual rain. So for something like this, I'm just gonna use a noise, very simple. So I'm just gonna reduce this to become 1 and the other one to become as big as I need to, and I'm just gonna reduce this guy. And at the moment nothing is moving because you need to move this up and down in this slider, and of course you want this to move down, and I'm just gonna associate this with my frame, but you'll see that it's not going to be enough. You see that it's really slow. So what I'm gonna say is I'm gonna multiply this by a variable that is not created yet, but I'm gonna call it speed. This will give me an error because this is not created yet. I'm calling a variable that is not created. So now what I'm gonna say is I'm gonna add a floating point slider. I'm gonna call that exactly in the same way in the name. In here I can choose whatever name, and then I'm gonna use this from 1 to say 200. This will be my speed, so I can now control the speed much better. Okay, so let's say that this is kind of what I'm going for. All right, let's just maybe do some of this linearity as well, and then I'm gonna use a transform so I can give it a bit of skew on X, so I'll have just a touch of an angle. And now I'm gonna add this to my picture. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna blur this quite a lot, say at least 100, maybe more, because I want to have an average color so I can introduce that in my particle. So now I can multiply directly like this. Now I'm gonna add this with an operation that makes sense for me. I would say that either screen or plus. Let's try screen. Okay, and what will be the result without this? It will be that. So let's take it just a touch. Okay, maybe we need to introduce a bit more of rain, like that. Maybe just as a tropical forest, a little bit less. And let's put some blur. By the way, this goes without saying, of course, but I'm not aiming for perfection here, just to get the technique going. So this is a way that you can associate something that probably you wouldn't remember, which is particles, to create the droplets, and use something very simple to create the rain. So normally it's the other way around. If you need to pass this script around, this will be very easy to randomize, because every time that you go here on your particles emitter, if you put this, now you have a different pattern if you change the random seed. So everybody could have different patterns, although with the same look, and that's exactly what the intention is. Let's increase the level of silliness in this example, just to illustrate a simple thing that can be very useful. So let's say that this is one of those globes that you have in Christmas, but let's say now that these droplets are steam droplets, so you don't want them to appear as if it was rain, so from nothing to something. You want to create and to grow them over time with a certain size. So let's create that globe kind of a thing at the end of everything. So I'm just going to put a crop in here, and I'm just going to drop a spherical transform. I'm just going to put this from light to long to a mirror ball. All right, so I'm just going to clean these things on top. Very bad paint job, but just to sell the point. So in here now, I don't want to have the particles coming from nothing to something. I want for them to grow over time as normally steam does. So I'm just going to open a particle expression. If you go on your size and say that you want the age of the particle divided by the life of the particle, these things will grow over time. So let's see what happens here. So you see that this will grow over time. Of course, you can have the same effect by using a particle curve in here, so you can affect the size as well, okay, in here with the curve. But if you want full precision, this is how you do it. You want age divided by life. If you want the exact inverse, you put 1 minus age divided by life, but that's not what I'm going for. I'm going for this. And now in here, just with this expression, I don't have actually the power of controlling what's the actual size of my particle when they grow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable here called particle size. This will create a new slider in here, and now I'm going to say that this will be multiplied by that variable. But because this is an expression, let's use a temporary variable in here and say that this will be the value that I have on that node that I've created, and this I'm going to call p size for particle size. And now what I'm going to say is that I'm going to multiply this expression by that variable. So p size is going to be multiplied by this thing in here. So now I have control over the size of my particle. So now let's see what happens. Of course, you want to disable the range for this example, and you want to put something here on the image just to fake the actual steam going on inside. So I just dropped these grades with a noise pattern that is moving slightly over time with an expression which is the frame divided by 30. So this will move a little bit, so the actual end look will be this. Very silly example. It's just for you to understand that you can do this type of things also with particles. So there you go. I've just added sharpen on the actual droplets and some chroma aberration. For this type of effect, I would probably add more than just one particle. So you have like smaller ones, probably with a different motion. They will grow slightly differently as well. So all of those things will add to the realism of the effect that you're after. Obviously, there's other ways to do it. Again, this is a very, very silly example. I'm not aiming for super realism or anything like that. It's just to tell you the technique and how you can use particles in ways that probably you wouldn't think of.